Chapter 10. He passed out of the room and began climbing the stairs. Basil Hallward followed close behind. They walked softly, as people always do at night. The lamp made strange shadows on the wall and stairs. When they reached the top, Dorian put the lamp down on the floor. He took the key out of his pocket and turned it in the lock. "You really want to know, Basil?" he asked in a low voice. "Yes." "I am delighted," he answered, smiling. Then he added, "You are the one man in the world I want to know everything about me. You have influenced my life more than you think." Taking up the lamp, he opened the door and went in. Cold air passed between them. "Shut the door behind you," he whispered, as he placed the lamp on the table. Hallward looked around the room in surprise. The room had clearly not been lived in for years. The whole place was covered with dust, and there were holes in the carpet. A mouse ran across the floor. "So, you think that it is only God who sees the soul, Basil. Take the cover off the portrait, and you will see mine." The voice that spoke was cold and cruel. "You are mad, Dorian," said Hallward, frowning. "You won't take the cover off? Then I will do it myself," said the young man, throwing the old purple curtain to the ground. A cry of fear came from the painter's lips when he saw the face in the portrait. It was Dorian Gray's face he was looking at, and it still had some of that wonderful beauty, but now there were terrible signs of age and corruption. But who had done it? He held the lamp up to the picture. In the left-hand corner was his name, painted in red. What had happened? He had never done that. Still, it was his own picture. He knew it, and it made his blood turn to ice. His own picture. What did it mean? Why had it changed? He turned and looked at Dorian Gray with the eyes of a sick man. The young man was standing near the wall watching him. He had taken the flower out of his coat and was smelling it. "What does this mean?" cried Hallward at last. His own voice sounded high and strange. "Years ago, when I was a boy," said Dorian Gray, closing his hand on the flower, "you met me and flattered me. You taught me to love my beauty. One day you introduced me to a friend of yours. He explained to me how wonderful it was to be young. You finished a portrait of me that showed me how wonderful it was to be beautiful. In a mad moment I made a wish." "I remember it. Oh, how well I remember it. No, the thing is impossible. There must be something wrong with the paint. I tell you, the thing is impossible." "Is anything really impossible?" said the young man, going over to the window. "You told me you had destroyed it." "I was wrong. It has destroyed me." "I don't believe it is my picture. There was nothing bad in it, nothing shameful. You were perfect to me. This is a face from hell." "It is the face of my soul. Each of us has heaven and hell in him, Basil," cried Dorian wildly. Hallward turned again to the portrait and stared at it. "My God, is this true?" he cried. "Is this what you have done with your life? You must be even worse than people say." Hallward threw himself into the chair by the table and put his face in his hands. The lamp fell to the floor and went out. "Good God, Dorian, what an awful lesson! What an awful lesson!" There was no answer, but he could hear the young man crying at the window. "We must ask God for forgiveness. I worshipped you too much. I am punished for it. You worshipped yourself too much. We are both punished." Dorian Gray turned slowly around and looked at him. There were tears in his eyes. "It is too late, Basil," he said. "But don't you see that hellish thing staring at us?" Dorian Gray looked at the picture. Suddenly he felt that he hated Basil Hallward. He hated the man sitting at the table more than he hated anything in his life. He looked wildly around. Something shone on top of the painted cupboard that faced him. It was a knife he had left there some days before. He moved slowly towards it, passing Hallward as he did so. He took the knife in his hand and turned around. Hallward moved in his chair. He rushed at him and stuck the knife into his neck again and again. He threw the knife down on the table and stood back. He could hear nothing but the sound of blood falling onto the carpet. He opened the door and went out onto the stairs. The house was completely quiet. No one was there. How quickly it had all been done. Feeling strangely calm, he walked over to the window and opened it. The wind had blown the fog away and the sky was clear. He looked down and saw a policeman walking down the street. He was shining a lamp in all the houses. Closing the window, he went back into the room. He did not look at the murdered man. He felt that the secret of the whole thing was not to think about it at all. The friend who had painted the terrible portrait had gone out of his life. That was enough. He picked up the lamp and walked out of the room, locking the door behind him. As he walked down the stairs, he thought that he heard what sounded like cries of pain. He stopped several times and waited. No. Everything was still. When he reached the library, he saw the bag and coat in the corner. They must be hidden away somewhere. He unlocked a secret cupboard and threw them in. He could easily burn them later. Then he pulled out his watch. It was 20 minutes to 2. He sat down and began to think. Basil Hallward had left the house at 11. No one had seen him come in again. The servants were in bed. Paris. Yes, it was to Paris that Basil had gone, and by the midnight train, as he had planned. It would be months before anyone suspected anything. Months! He could destroy everything long before then. Suddenly he had a thought. He put on his coat and hat and went into the front room. From the window he could see the policeman passing the house. He waited and held his breath. After a few moments he went out of the house, shutting the door very gently behind him. Then he began ringing the bell. In about 5 minutes a servant appeared. He was half-dressed and looked very sleepy. "I am sorry I had to wake you up, Francis," he said, stepping in, "but I have forgotten my key. What time is it?" 10 minutes past 2, sir," answered the man, looking at a clock. 10 minutes past 2. How horribly late. You must wake me at 9 tomorrow. I have some work to do." "All right, sir." "Did anyone call this evening?" "Mr. Hallward, sir. He stayed here until 11 and then he went away to catch his train." "Oh, I am sorry I didn't see him. Did he leave any message?" "No, sir. He said he would write to you from Paris." "That is all, Francis. Don't forget to call me at 9 tomorrow." "No, sir." The man went off to his bedroom. Dorian Gray threw his hat and coat upon the table and passed into the library. For a quarter of an hour he walked up and down the room, biting his lip and thinking. Then he took down a book from one of the cupboards and began to turn the pages. Alan Campbell, 152, Hertford Street, Mayfair. Yes, that was the man he wanted. Chapter 11. At 9 o'clock the next morning, his servant came in with a cup of chocolate and opened the curtains. Dorian was sleeping quite peacefully, lying with one hand under his cheek. As he opened his eyes, a smile passed across his lips. He turned round and began to drink his chocolate. The November sun came into the room and the sky was bright. It was almost like a morning in May. Slowly he remembered what had happened the night before. The dead man was still sitting there, and in the sunlight now. How horrible that was. Such terrible things were for the darkness, not the day. After he had drunk his cup of chocolate, he went over to the table and wrote 2 letters. One he put in his pocket, and the other he handed to his servant. "Take this round to 152 Hertford Street, Francis. If Mr. Campbell is out of town, get his address." When the servant had gone, he lit a cigarette and began drawing on a piece of paper. First he drew flowers, then houses, then human faces. Suddenly he realized that every face he drew looked like Basil Hallward. He frowned and went over to lie on the sofa. An hour went past very slowly. Every second he kept looking up at the clock. As the minutes went by, he became horribly worried. He got up and walked around the room. His hands were strangely cold. At last the door opened and his servant entered. "Mr. Campbell, sir," said the man. The colour came back to his cheeks. "Ask him to come in at once, Francis." He felt himself again. His fear had gone away. In a few moments, Alan Campbell walked in. He looked very angry and rather worried. "Alan, this is kind of you. I thank you for coming." "I hoped never to enter your house again, Gray, but you said it was a question of life and death." His voice was hard and cold, and he kept his hands in the pockets of his coat. "Yes, it is a question of life and death, Alan, and to more than one person. Sit down." Campbell took a chair by the table, and Dorian sat opposite him. The 2 men's eyes met. In Dorian's there was great sadness. He knew that what he was going to do was terrible. After a moment of silence, Dorian said very quietly, "Alan, in a locked room at the top of the house, a dead man is sitting at a table. He has been dead for 10 hours now. Don't stir, and don't look at me like that. You don't need to know who this man is. You don't need to know how or why he died. What you have to do is this." "Stop, Gray. I don't want to know anything more. I don't care if what you tell me is true or not true. I don't want any part in your life. Keep your horrible secrets to yourself. They don't interest me any more." "Alan, they will have to interest you." "I am awfully sorry for you, Alan, but I can't help myself. You are the one man who can save me. Alan, you are a scientist. You know about chemistry and things of that kind. What you have got to do is to destroy the thing that is upstairs." "You are mad, Dorian. I will have nothing to do with this." "He killed himself, Alan." "I am glad of that. But who made him do it? You, I suppose." "Do you still refuse to do this for me?" "Of course I refuse. You have come to the wrong man. Go to some of your friends. Don't come to me." "Alan, it was murder. I killed him. You don't know what he made me suffer." "Murder? Good God, Dorian. Is that what you have come to? I will have nothing to do with it." "You must have something to do with it. Don't ask any more questions. I have told you too much already. But you must do this. We were friends once, Alan." "Don't speak of those days, Dorian. They are dead." "They will hang me for this, Alan. Don't you understand? They will kill me for what I have done." Campbell got up to leave. "I will not have anything to do with this." "You refuse?" "Yes." The same look of sadness came into Dorian Gray's eyes. Then he took a piece of paper and wrote something on it. He read it over and pushed it across the table. Then he got up and went over to the window. Campbell looked at him in surprise and picked up the paper. As he read it, his face went white, and he fell back in his chair. After 2 or 3 minutes without speaking, Dorian came and stood next to him. "I am very sorry for you, Alan," he said, putting his hand on his shoulder. "But there is no other way. I have a letter written already. Here it is. You see the address. If you don't help me, I will send it. You know what will happen. But you are going to help me. It is impossible for you to refuse now." Campbell put his face in his hands. "The thing is quite simple, Alan. It has to be done. Face it and do it." A terrible sound came from Campbell's lips. "Come, Alan, you must decide now." Alan paused for a moment. "Is there a fire in the room upstairs?" "Yes, there is a gas fire." "I must go home and get some things." "No, Alan, you must not leave the house. Write out what you want, and my servant will get the things for you." It was nearly 2 o'clock when the servant returned with an enormous wooden box filled with the things Campbell had asked for. "You can have the rest of the day to yourself, Francis." "Thank you, sir." When the servant had left, the two men carried the box up the stairs. Dorian took out the key and turned it in the lock. Then he stopped, and Campbell saw that his eyes were full of tears. "I don't think I can go in, Alan," he said. "I don't need you," said Campbell coldly. Dorian half opened the door. As he did so, he saw the face of the portrait staring in the sunlight. He remembered that the night before he had forgotten to cover the picture. He was about to rush forward when he saw something that made him jump back. There was blood on one of the hands in the portrait. How horrible it was! He hurried into the room, trying not to look at the dead man. Picking the curtain off the floor, he threw it over the picture. Then he rushed out of the room and down the stairs. It was long after 7 when Campbell came back into the library. He was quiet and white in the face, but very calm. "I have done what you asked me to do," he said. "And now goodbye. Let us never see each other again." "You have saved me, Alan. I cannot forget that," said Dorian simply. When Campbell had left, he went upstairs. There was a horrible smell in the room, but the thing that had been sitting at the table was gone. Chapter 12. "Don't tell me that you are going to be good," cried Lord Henry. "You're quite perfect. Don't change." Dorian Gray shook his head. "No, Harry. I have done too many terrible things in my life. I am not going to do any more. But tell me, what is happening here in London? I have been out of the country for more than a month." "People are still discussing poor Basil's disappearance." "Are they not bored with that yet?" said Dorian, pouring out some wine and frowning. "My dear boy, they have only been talking about it for 6 weeks. The British only need one subject of conversation every 3 months. They have been very lucky recently, though. First there was the scandal of my wife leaving me, and then Alan Campbell killed himself. Now there is the mysterious disappearance of an artist. The British police are saying that Basil did take the midnight train on the 9th of November, but the French police are sure that he never arrived in Paris at all." "What do you think has happened to Basil?" asked Dorian, holding up his wine against the light. "I have no idea. If Basil wants to hide himself, it is no business of mine. If he is dead, I don't want to think about him. Death is the only thing that ever frightens me. I hate it." "Why?" said the younger man in a tired voice. "Because," said Lord Henry, "it is the only thing that is final. Let us have our coffee in the music-room, Dorian. You must play Chopin to me. The man who ran away with my wife played Chopin beautifully. Poor Victoria. I was very fond of her. The house is quite lonely without her." Dorian said nothing, but went into the next room and sat at the piano. After the coffee had been brought in, he stopped playing. "Harry," he said, looking over at Lord Henry, "do you think Basil was murdered?" Lord Henry yawned. "Everyone liked Basil. Who would want to murder him? He was not clever enough to have enemies. Of course he was a wonderful painter, but a man can paint like Velasquez and yet still be rather boring. Basil was really rather boring. The only thing that interested me about him was that he worshipped you." "I was very fond of Basil," said Dorian sadly. "But don't people say he was murdered?" "Oh, some newspapers do. But I don't think it is likely. I know there are awful places in Paris, but Basil was not the sort of man to go to them. What would you say, Harry, if I told you that I had murdered Basil? Said the younger man. He watched him carefully after he had spoken. No, Dorian, you would not murder anyone. It is ordinary people who murder. It is their way of finding the extraordinary pleasure that art gives us. A way of finding the extraordinary pleasure? Do you think that a man who has murdered could do it again? Don't tell me that. Oh, anything becomes a pleasure if you do it too often, cried Lord Henry, laughing. That is one of the most important secrets of life. I believe, though, that murder is always a mistake. One should never do anything one cannot talk about after dinner. But let us pass from poor Basil. I wish I could believe that he has died some romantic death, but I can't. He probably fell into the Seine off a bus. I can see him now lying on his back in the dirty green water. During the last 10 years he had not been painting well. Lord Henry walked across the room and touched the head of a strange grey bird that he kept in the music-room. Then he turned to face Dorian. Yes, he continued, taking his handkerchief out of his pocket. His painting seemed to me to have lost something. When you and he stopped being great friends, he stopped being a great artist. What was it that separated you? I suppose he bored you. If so, he never forgave you. By the way, what happened to that wonderful portrait he did of you? I don't think I've ever seen it since he finished it. I told you years ago that it was stolen. Oh, I remember. You never got it back? What a shame. It really was wonderful. I remember I wanted to buy it. I wish I had it now. I never really liked it, said Dorian. I am sorry I sat for it. The memory of the thing is hateful to me. How sad you look. Don't be so serious. Play me some music, Dorian. And as you play, tell me in a low voice why you still look so young. I am only 10 years older than you are, and I have grey hair and yellow skin. You are really wonderful, Dorian. Harry, please. You have never looked more charming than you do tonight. You remind me of the day I first saw you. You were very shy and absolutely extraordinary. You have changed, of course, but not in appearance. You are still the same. I am not the same, Harry. Yes, you are the same. I wish I could change places with you, Dorian. The world has cried out against us both, but it has always worshipped you. It always will worship you. Life has been your art. Dorian got up from the piano and passed his hand through his hair. Yes, life has been beautiful, he said quietly. But I am not going to have the same life, Harry, and you must not say these things to me. You don't know everything about me. I think that if you did, even you would turn away from me. You laugh. Don't laugh. Why have you stopped playing, Dorian? Let us go to the club. It has been a charming evening, and we must end it charmingly. There is someone I want to introduce to you, young Lord Poole. He has already copied your ties, and he very much wants to meet you. He is quite charming, and he reminds me of you. I hope not, said Dorian, with a sad look in his eyes. But I am tired tonight, Harry. I won't go to the club. It is nearly 11, and I want to go to bed early. Please stay. You have never played so well as tonight. It is because I am going to be good, he answered, smiling. I am a little changed already. You can't change to me, Dorian, said Lord Henry. You and I will always be friends. Come round tomorrow. We shall go to lunch. Do you really want me to come, Harry? Certainly. The park is quite lovely now. I don't think there have been such flowers since the year I met you. Very well. I shall be here at 11, said Dorian. Good night, Harry. Chapter 13. It was a lovely night. He walked home with his coat on his arm, smoking his cigarette. 2 young men in evening dress passed him. He heard one of them whisper to the other, "That is Dorian Gray." He remembered how pleased he used to be when he was stared at or talked about. He was tired of hearing his own name now. When he reached home, he found his servant waiting up for him. He sent him to bed and threw himself down on the sofa in the library. He began to think about some of the things that Lord Henry had said to him. Was it really true that one could never change? There had been a time when he had been good and innocent. He had corrupted himself and become a terrible influence on others. He had even got pleasure from this corruption. Yet his soul had once been the purest of all. Was all that gone? Was there no hope for him? In one terrible moment of passion he had asked to stay young for all time. All his failure had been because of that. He had not been punished, but perhaps punishment was what he had needed. Punishment cleaned the soul. The mirror that Lord Henry had given to him so many years ago now was standing on the table. He picked it up, remembering that horrible night when he had first noticed the change in the picture. Once, someone who had loved him passionately had written him a mad letter. It had ended with these words: "The world is changed because you are made of gold." He repeated them to himself and suddenly realized that he hated his own beauty. Throwing the mirror on the floor, he broke the glass into little pieces with his foot. It was his beauty that had spoiled him. It was better not to think of the past. Nothing could change that. He had to think of his future. Alan Campbell had shot himself one night, and his terrible secret had died with him. The interest in Basil Hallward's disappearance would soon pass away. He was perfectly safe there. What worried him was the death of his own soul. Basil had painted the portrait that had destroyed his life. He could not forgive him that. It was the portrait that had done everything. The murder had just been the madness of the moment. As for Alan Campbell, he had killed himself. It was nothing to do with Dorian Gray. A new life. That was what he wanted. That was what he was waiting for. Perhaps it had begun already. He would never again spoil innocence. He would be good. He began to wonder if the portrait in the locked room had changed. Was it still as horrible as it had been? Perhaps if his life became pure, the face in the portrait would become beautiful again. He would go and look. He took the lamp from the table and went upstairs. As he opened the door, a smile of happiness passed across his young face. Yes, he would be good, and the ugly thing he had locked away would not frighten him any more. He felt happier already. He went in quietly, locking the door behind him. Walking straight over to the portrait, he took off the purple curtain that was covering it. An angry cry of pain came from him. He could see no change. The thing was still hateful, more hateful even than before. The red mark on the hand seemed brighter and more like new blood. And why was the red mark larger than it had been? It was all over the fingers now. There was blood on the painted feet and blood on the hand that had not held the knife. What did it all mean? That he should go to the police? That he should tell the whole story and be put to death? He laughed. He felt the idea was absurd. If he did tell them now, who would believe him? There was nothing left of the murdered man anywhere. He had destroyed everything belonging to Basil Hallward. He himself had burnt the bag and the coat. They would simply say he was mad. Was this murder to follow him all his life? Was he always going to suffer because of his past? Yet what could he do? Go to the police? Never. There was only one thing they could use against him, and that was the picture itself. He would destroy it. Why had he kept it so long? Once it had given him pleasure to watch it changing and growing old. Recently he had felt no such pleasure. It had kept him awake at night. When he had been away, he had been frightened that another person would see it. Just the memory of it spoiled many moments of happiness. He would destroy it. He looked around and saw the knife that had killed Basil Hallward. He had cleaned it many times until there was no mark left on it. It was bright, and it shone. It had killed the painter. Now it would kill the painter's work, and all that it meant. It would kill the past. When that was dead, he would be free. He picked up the knife and pushed it into the picture. There was a cry and a crash. The cry was so horrible that frightened servants woke and came out of their rooms. 2 gentlemen who were passing in the square below stopped and looked up at the great house. They hurried on until they met a policeman and brought him back. The policeman rang the bell several times, but there was no answer. Except for a light in one of the top windows, the house was all dark. After a time he went away and stood in the garden of the next house and watched. "Whose house is that?" asked the older of the 2 gentlemen. "Mr. Dorian Gray's, sir," answered the policeman. They looked at each other as they walked away and laughed cruelly. They knew who Dorian Gray was. Inside the house the servants were talking in low whispers to each other. Old Mrs. Leaf was crying. Francis was as white as death. After about a quarter of an hour they went fearfully upstairs. They knocked, but there was no reply. They called out. Everything was still. They tried the door. It was locked. Finally they got on the roof and came into the room through the window. When they entered the room, they found a portrait hanging on the wall. It showed Mr. Dorian Gray as they had last seen him, young and beautiful. Lying on the floor was a dead man in evening dress. He had a knife in his heart. He was old and horribly ugly. It was not until they saw his rings that they recognized who the man was.